This section is an introduction to the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. The study of Scripture, religious writing which has a high authority within a particular religion, the study of Scripture is one of the humanities. It's one of the disciplines within the humanities. And so I want to give you a brief introduction to the academic study of the Hebrew Bible, the academic study of the Old Testament. Christianity, because of its roots in Judaism, will keep the Hebrew Bible, retain the Hebrew Bible as Scripture, and that's what Christians call the Old Testament. You'll understand a little bit more about what I mean by that when we talk about the development of Christianity over the next few lectures. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. I'd like you to learn another word for the Hebrew Bible, though. It might be a new word for some of you, but I want you to learn the word Tanakh. The word Tanakh, to refer to the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament in a specifically Jewish context. By that I mean that if you go to if you stop by a synagogue to drop in on a Sabbath service just to see what was going on, and you sat down in the pew and there was a pew rack in front of you, and there was a copy of the Hebrew Bible in the pew rack, it probably has the word Tanakh on the cover. Or if you went to Barnes & Noble or Books A Million and looked for a copy of the Hebrew Bible specifically aimed at a Jewish reading audience, then it probably has the word Tanakh on the cover. Like this one. There you see the word. Let me get my pen here. There we go. Here you see the word Tanakh on the cover. JPS, don't worry about that. That's Jewish Publication Society. It's a large publishing house. The word Tanakh. I'd like you to learn the word Tanakh as referring to the Hebrew Bible in a specifically Jewish context, because it'll do two things for you. First of all, you will see the word, and when you do, I want you to know something about what the word refers to. It is an important book for an awful lot of people. And then it'll also help remind you of the three divisions of the Hebrew Bible. Because the word Tanakh is not really a word. It's what's called an acronym. It would be easier for me just to give you some examples of acronyms instead of defining what an acronym is for you. But, for example, CCF is an acronym. College of Central Florida. For that matter, JPS is an acronym for Jewish Publication Society. So there's all kinds of acronyms out there. CIA, MTV, CSI, there's all kinds of acronyms out there. The word Tanakh is in English letters here, Roman letters, the letters we use in the English alphabet. The word Tanakh in Hebrew is written down here. Hebrew is read from right to left, the opposite of English. This letter makes the T sound. This letter here makes the N sound. And this letter here makes the KH sound. The T and the N and the KH stand for the three different parts of the Hebrew Bible. So here's this word Tanakh again. The first part of the word Tanakh, the T part of the word, stands for the word Torah. That's right here. For most Jewish groups today, and I'm well aware there's more than one group of Jewish people in the world today, the Torah would be the most important part of the Tanakh, the most important part of the Hebrew Bible, because it contains the law. And I try to communicate to you in lecture how important the law is for ancient Hebrew society, ancient Hebrew religion, and certainly for most groups within Judaism today. So that's the T part of the word there, which stands for the word Torah. The N part of the word here stands for a word that you don't really need to worry about learning the Hebrew word for. It's the word Nebim. You see that word, the T here, and here. You don't worry about learning that N word. You do need to know the word Torah. Okay, that's a significant word to know. And know that it refers to the law. Don't worry about this Hebrew word here. But don't worry about the Hebrew word. But the second part of the Tanakh is the prophets. In this diagram, they've divided the prophets into two groups. Don't worry about being too technical here. The second part here deals with the prophets. We'll actually be taking a closer look at the prophets in class as a closer look at a particular part of the Hebrew Bible. We'll do that in class. The KH part of the word here refers to another Hebrew word you don't really need to worry about learning, the Ketubim. Down here, you see that word down here, the K part of the word here, which means the writings. If that word writing seems kind of vague to you, well, it's kind of vague on purpose. It includes all kinds of things that aren't either They don't fit into the law, they don't fit into the prophets, and so they fit into the writings. For example, in the writings you have the book of Psalms. The Psalms are songs that are sung in worship at the temple. Many of them attributed to David. We'll be talking about David in class. There's also a collection of books called a collection of wise sayings, called the Proverbs. After, I think that's chapter 4 of the book of Proverbs, these sayings are pretty much one sentence, one-liner kind of wise sayings, almost like fortune cookie kind of wise sayings. About 3/4 of them are attributed to Solomon. I'll be mentioning Solomon to you in class, and others attributed to some other writers. You also have other things that don't seem to fit into the laws or the prophets, almost like novels, like the book of Job, or Ruth, or Daniel, Ezra, Esther, some others there, the Song of Songs, Nehemiah. I mean, there's a bunch of different books that don't seem to fit into the law or the prophets. Here you have a different outline of the Hebrew Bible with those same divisions: the Torah, the law, the prophets, and the writing. The Torah made up of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Their names you see there in English out of the Greek translation: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, while Christians call the Pentateuch, Jewish people call the Torah. And again, that would be, for most Jewish groups today, the most important part of the Torah. Let's see if I can write this with my mouse, because it contains the law. And I'll be trying to communicate to you in the lecture how important the laws are certainly for ancient Hebrew religion. Again, we'll be talking more about the prophets in class. We'll be taking class time to go over, take a quick look at the prophets. It comes as a surprise to a lot of English readers of the Old Testament, a lot of English readers of the Hebrew Bible, that the Hebrew Bible is written primarily in poetry. If we wanted to pick the dominant form of writing style in the Hebrew Bible, we'd say that an awful lot of it is written in poetry. Taking a look at this list here, the Psalms are written in poetry because they are songs. Songs are poems. The Proverbs are written in poetry. The Song of Songs is another song, another love poem, so it is written in poetry. There are big parts of the book of Job, Ruth, certainly Daniel, written as poetry. When we look at the prophets write almost entirely in poetry. In fact, that Hebrew word for prophet, Nevim, is the Hebrew word for poet. They mean the same thing, because the prophets write in poetry. And even a significant part of the laws are presented as poetry. Large section of the Hebrew Bible written in poetry. I say this comes as a surprise to a lot of English readers, because Hebrew poetry works in a very different way than English poetry works. English poetry tends to rely on the repetition of sound. Now, don't tell the English teachers I'm telling you this, but when you read a poem, don't you kind of expect a poem to rhyme? I think we do. We kind of expect a poem to rhyme. I know they don't have to, and don't tell the English teachers I'm saying this, but I think pretty much we do. We kind of expect to find a rhyme when we read or listen to poetry. And that's because, English poetry tends to rely on a repetition of sounds, and the most obvious, the rhyme at the end of the lines. Even little kids pick up on that. You've seen that. And then there's all those other repetitions of sounds that are built into English poetry, like the rhythm of the poem, the meter, that's what they call it in literature course, the rhythm of the poem, the meter of the poem. All those fancy words you learn in a literature course, you don't need to worry about learning them here, for us in this course, but you may have had a literature course where you studied euphony, the repeated vowel sounds, or cacophony, the repeated consonant sounds, or alliteration, the repetition of the first letter of a word. That belongs really in a literature course, but the repetition of sounds. And at some point, I hope you have had or will have a literature teacher who will sit you down and work through a poem with you and point out to you all the different network of sounds in the poetry. Well, this is English poetry. English poetry tends to rely on this repetition of sound. Hebrew poetry, though, doesn't rely on a repetition of sound. Instead, Hebrew poetry relies on a repetition of ideas or images. It's a rhythm of images, a rhyme of ideas. There's not a repetition of sounds, again, but a repetition of ideas and images. We're going to be taking a quick look here at some Hebrew poetry. Now, we're not going to analyze the poetry. We're not going to be concerned about really the content even, other than just to see how this poetry works. The structure of the poetry, what's sometimes called the parallel structure, the repetition of ideas and images. We're going to be taking a look at one of the prophets, Isaiah. Isaiah is one of the prophets. Like I said, a very important prophet. We'll say more about the prophets in class. Again, we're not really dealing with the content and analysis of the poem here. Just want to see how the poem works. Be looking at a section from the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, from the New International Version, which lays out the poetry as poetry in lines. We're just going to jump into the poem and just see how the parallel structure works here. Isaiah 40, verse 21. Let's start here. The prophet asks, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded?" Do you see here how these are 4 different ways of asking the same question? Don't you know? Haven't you heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? Well, now, one way that this parallel structure, this repetition of ideas works, is that it kind of builds suspense. I mean, what if, after class one day, on your way out of class, you stop by the desk where I hang out until everybody is gone, and you asked me, you came up to the desk and you said, "I've got a question for you." And I said, "Sure, go ahead." And you said, "Well, are you still going to drop the lowest midterm exam grade like you said you would?" And I said to you, "Don't you know? Haven't you heard? Weren't you told the first day of class? Have you not understood since the syllabus was handed out?" Well, what would your response be? You'd say, well, what? What's the big deal? Well, what's the big deal? And that's part of the suspense building. Now, what's the big deal? Don't you know? Haven't you heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? Well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal, that's God. He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. God is so great, so big, powerful, that when he looks down at planet Earth, the people are just like grasshoppers to a human being. That's how powerful God is. This is still God, stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. You see the repeated image of cloth being spread out. In this sense like a canopy, in this sense like a tent. God is so big that when it comes to putting the stars in the sky, stretching out the heavens, it's like setting up a tent to God. That's still God, brings the princes, that's the powerful people, the big shots, to nothing, and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. The repeated ideas brings the princes to naught, reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. The repeated image of the big shots being brought down in front of God's power. And then we have the same kind of repetition again. No sooner are they planted, the powerful people, no sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground. 3 very similar images there. Slightly different, but very similar. Being planted, being sown, taking root in the ground. Then what? Then that's God, blows on them and they wither away, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. Chaff is like dry grass kind of stuff. Here we've got the repeated image of air moving. He blows on them and they wither away. A whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. The repeated image of air moving. The prophet asks, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and complain, O Israel?" You'll see why these terms are parallel to each other. Well, you'll see this during the lecture. But Jacob and Israel, there's a connection there. You'll see it. You'll see it in the lecture. So the prophet asks first Jacob and then Israel, "Why do you complain about God?" We talked about this in class. This tension, this kind of upsetness that is almost stereotypical of ancient Hebrew religion, and to some extent almost stereotypical of Judaism, for there to be almost always just a little tinge of upsetness and disappointment. "Why do you complain to God?" the prophet says, "that my way is hidden from the Lord, and my cause is disregarded by my God." In other words, why is God ignoring me? Why isn't God paying attention to me? Why do you complain to God that he's not paying attention to you? And then the prophet asks again, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? Two different ways to say the same thing. The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. You see how that's the same thing? It's just two different expressions of the same thing. He gives strength to whom? To the weary or the tired. He increases the power of whom? Of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. Even the repetition here of youths and young men growing tired and weary, stumbling and falling, that parallel structure there. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Here again you've got this parallel structure. They will run, they will walk, and they will not grow weary, and they will not be faint. Hebrew poetry is kind of interesting. First, it's kind of an interesting idea that you can have a different kind of poetry than English poetry. It's kind of an interesting idea. It does have a rhythm to it, and maybe even heard me falling into that rhythm just reading through here. You start to get into the rhythm of the repetition of the ideas, just like you get into the rhythm of music or a poem that you're reading or whatever. There's a rhythm of ideas there that you kind of get into as you read it. And then, well, it translates very well. We can read the poetry as poetry in English or in whatever language one can read in. You don't have to go to the original language to hear the repetition of the sounds, because what's really important is the repetition of ideas. Well, that's going to conclude a quick introduction to the Hebrew Bible.